It was Friday morning when the Muslim youngster went to her classroom cubby and found this note calling her a terrorist.
A man has been arrested after video of him attacking an employee at a McDonald's went viral.
John! Wait! Hey, stop!
Now, in the early hours of New Year's Day, a 50-year-old German man rammed his silver Mercedes into a crowd of people in Germany's Bottrop city. The police are dubbing it to be a hate crime.
Well, a manhunt is underway for the gunman who shot and killed a 7-year-old girl in a Walmart parking lot. Jasmine Barnes was shot in the head when a man opened fire on their car, seemingly at random.
I replayed this moment in my head over 1 million times. I didn't do anything. I didn't make a wrong turn. I didn't get over in his lane. He fired off at us for no reason.
A racially charged Snapchat post has landed one student in big legal trouble, and the victim's family is taking matters into their own hands, claiming the school has not done enough about it.
There's a threat made on her life, and there was a call for others to participate in it. The caption said, "We must lynch her."
The apparent cruelty is a stomach turner. In a video that's gone viral, a 15-year-old refugee is apparently attacked. He's grabbed by the throat, thrown to the floor, and then has water poured over his face.
When we talk about human progression, we often use yardsticks such as advancement in technology or how man has conquered nature. What we often fail to take into account is how far we have come in terms of our humanity. When every other day, some news breaks out regarding racial discrimination, either in the form of the shooting of a black 7-year-old girl or the racial profiling of a Muslim individual, or the discrimination of anyone whose skin color is seen to be inferior. It begs the question, how far have we come as human beings? Today we discuss racial discrimination and the legacies of the past that continue to exist today. We also discuss if we can hope for a better future. Welcome to Indus Special, and I'm Meshal Malik. To explore racial discrimination, we welcome our esteemed guests to this show. We are joined by Dr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa, who is a faculty member at the University of Edinburgh. We are also joined by Tahir Abbas, who is a sociologist, Rahim ul Haq, who is a research fellow at the Center for Public Policy and Governance at FC College, and Asif Akil, who is a journalist and a social researcher. Thank you all for joining us. Mr. Tahir Abbas, I'd like to begin the conversation with you. So there's a very simple statement that no one is born racist. How do these racist sentiments develop then?
Well, you're absolutely right. Nobody's born racist. So racism is a socially learned concept. We learn to be racist through the actions of people around us, the people who influence us, our parents, our teachers, the books we read, the environment that contains us. So we learn racism, and so we have to actively dislearn racism, and that's not always so easy given the current thread of hate, of vilification, of how easy it is to normalize hate. And so I think these are the problems. It's a socially learned concept, and we have to find ways of working through that.
Yes, and dislearning is a process that must be rigged with a lot of complexities there. But before we get to that, I'd like to understand more how exactly racism is constructed. And for that, I'll take the debate here in the studio. Mr. Asif Akil, so how does that process of racism actually begin? How do we dehumanize and otherize those around us to see them differently?
Which just Professor has just mentioned that socialization is the process when a child is born, even not when a child starts to taking shape in his mother's womb. Process of socialization begins then. And then we have seen that over the past several millennia, human beings have got divided themselves in colors. That was the first thing. Like we know that Homo sapiens, when they arrived in Europe, and they had interaction with Neanderthal, that has given us a hue of skin colors. And based on their achievements in physical world, that has played a very big role in giving rise to this color preference and this all, the things that we have now, name what we see today as racism.
And Mr. Rahimul Haq, on that same point that we're talking about, how important is it to identify someone as being different than you for the for racist sentiments to be fostered?
Right. I mean, you always, you know, your own identity or creation of identity is you can think of it as a process of otherness, because for me to understand myself, I have to differentiate myself from others. So that particular process starts at a very early age, as already discussed. The question is that otherness that actually leads to identity creation and everyone's identity creation can, you know, does that process move far enough that you create prejudices against the other? You actually actively participate in discriminating against the other. So for me, you know, the process of otherness does happen, you know, for everyone. It's a question of whether you add prejudices and discrimination in that process.
So what you're saying is the construction of self-identity is contingent upon otherizing someone else.
Yes.
But
Partly.
otherizing doesn't necessarily have to be negative. What becomes negative is when you associate certain prejudices, certain stereotypes to the other.
Yes, yes.
I think one important aspect is that the creating otherness actually ultimately translates into inequalities. And those inequalities are created for material gain, for accessing or making yourself more having more possession. So I think wherever there are inequalities, that only mean one, which Rahim Saab teaches, political economy. So this ultimately leads to this division of labor and of possession.
That's a great point there. And while we're discussing otherization, I'd also like to take the question to Dr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa. The question of scientific racism, and it has been largely debunked in today's age, but I want to understand how much of that set the premise for modern day racism.
I think that's very key to the way modern racism plays out, because if we were to create a timeline and identify when modern forms of racism begin, it will be around the 1930s and so on, when theories of eugenics and various scientific theories about genetic ideas were sort of feeding into a host of philosophical ideas, and were then combined with various political forces to create a kind of system. And I think that's what racism ultimately is. We're not really talking about individual acts of discrimination. We're talking about a systemic approach where you create systems of knowledge, systems of power, which come together to create racial hierarchies, right? Where one group is entirely regarded as subjugated or inferior, and another is regarded as superior. So science actually or the scientific approach can, of course, be used and has been used in the past to justify various forms of racism.
Yes. And Dr. Mustafa, something that's been justified on the basis of scientific racism or certain races being inferior is colonialism, slavery in the United States. And I want to understand, how were these institutionalized forms of discrimination in the past responsible for developing and fostering racism in these developed nations today?
Well, I think what happens is that if, as a society, we regard science to be a superior form of knowledge, more important, say, than religion or other forms of traditional received knowledge, then if scientists can be co-opted into that larger philosophical, cultural project of trying to dehumanize certain races, whether they're Jews or black people or so on, then that idea catches on very quickly, because scientists are the people to whom the rest of society is looking to set the agenda, to find out what is and is not true factually. So once science creates a kind of discourse based on genetics, let's say, of racism or racial hierarchies, that will very quickly filter down into the rest of society, which will then, recreate and mimic those forms of racial discrimination in other forms of cultural production, through the media, through art, through, various legal regimes, which are then designed to reinforce what is perceived to be a scientific basis for racism.
And Dr. Mustafa, I'd also like a sociological perspective on this from Mr. Tahir Abbas. So on that same question of slavery, institutionalized colonialism, the apartheid, all these things that happened, how has that fed into racism today?
So absolutely, as been stated, that racism finds itself reproduced in these institutions, but these institutions are also means through keep power and privilege in the hands of the few. And so we have a situation where the education system is designed essentially to reproduce privileged outcomes for existing privileged people, placing therefore minorities and new groups at the bottom of the pecking order of these priorities. And we look at the criminal justice system, how young black men get picked up for alleged crimes at far greater rates, and then when they do, there are greater rates of arrests, of referral, and then sentencing. So these are institutional practices in education, in the questions of the criminal justice system. When we think about just the allocation of resources in society, the richer part of the country, for example, England, is in the south, whereas the north is the poorer, industrialized and deindustrialized zones where minorities first came and settled. So these are all linked through the ways in which the economy, aspects of the institutions of government operate and result in ongoing ethnic inequalities in various ways.
Mr. Tahir Abbas, and also how has racial profiling changed in the couple of decades that we have seen? Can you expand upon that?
Yes, indeed. So when we think of racism, how there's prejudice towards people of a particular color, the darker the skin color, often the greater the prejudice, linked to slavery, linked to colonialism, linked to scientific racism. And when we think of, say, policing practices or security and surveillance at airports or checkpoints, people of minority backgrounds are far more likely to be targeted due to some notion of suspicion that's based on some inherent stereotype that is loaded with misinformation and then obviously the historical legacy associated with that. So we see ordinary people in everyday settings that take with them these misunderstandings of other people from other parts of the world, and then it's heightened by the political climate in which we currently live in.
And Dr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa, I'd also like to ask from you, how has the political climate enabled individuals to practice in racial discrimination? Even now, more so than ever before, we're seeing many anti-immigration movements on the rise, and the basic premise of that is fearing xenophobia, fearing the other person coming in. How has the political climate enabled that?
I think certainly we're seeing that throughout the world, aren't we? And not just in Europe and America, but also, of course, in parts of Asia. I think the way it is done is essentially by where throughout the world we're seeing a return to populist politics. And what that means is very popular narratives of cultural cohesion amongst one's own racial identity, and projecting all kinds of negative associations onto other racial and ethnic groups. We're seeing that throughout the world. So in the case of the United Kingdom, for example, we're seeing an attempt to classify colonial history as something that was not problematic, that British people should be proud of, and kind of ignoring the human cost of the process. So I think certainly there is, with the rise of populism, we are seeing politicians pander to that kind of narrative of creating this idea that there was a simpler, purer, less complicated past, and somehow things have become more complicated as a result of this interaction with other races and the various problems that have arisen as a result of that. So it is something that we're seeing throughout, and I think it's just a global trend of returning popularism.
And Dr. Mustafa, hold on to that thought. I'd like to take the debate back here in the studio. Mr. Rahimul Haq, we have been talking about colonization and how that impacted the colonizer's perception. But what we haven't mentioned here up till now is how racism back then has impacted the social milieu of the people who were colonized. Could you tell us about that?
Right. I mean, there's a very simple term for it. It's called colonization of the mind. Right? So even if you supposedly get decolonized. You have your own state, but the state itself was created, at least the state that we're living in, was created by the British.
Yep.
So it carries those germs. It's basically the reason it's called a post-colonial state is because the structures come from a certain ethos, you know, that was created then. So I think I can give a couple of examples, you know, where I've been. I mean, if you look at South Africa, you know, which is more recent, it's been now 25 years, you know, since the end of apartheid. But if you look at South Africa, you know, the kind of problems they have even now, a lot of them, those problems come from apartheid. Right? And although the blacks have had now a political government or political power for, you know, a quarter of a decade, but still the economic structure and the social structure of South Africa, you know, stays as it was earlier because there has not been any, you know, economic redistribution. So in that sense, you know, even if you have political
What do you
power.
mean by economic distribution here?
I mean, you know, if you look at the land distribution in South Africa, I don't have the exact numbers, but let's just say, you know, 9% or 7-8% of the population who are white, you know, the upper classes own 70-80% of the land, you know, where you can have agriculture or grazing. So it's not a question of now, it's a question of that unequal economic and social conditions, you know, over centuries, you know, will continue for at least, you know, a while, unless and until we've discussed the, you know, criminal justice system, but unless and until the state, you know, consciously makes an effort to, you know, tackle racism, those structures, as we talk about the US, you know, and other societies, you know, those structures will stay. So in the US, the police is still groomed, you know, in the old system.
Before we move on to the contemporary debates, something that you mentioned which was very interesting was the colonization of the mind. And during the decolonization process, of course, it's important to reclaim your culture, reclaim your identity. But we're seeing that maybe that has not yet been fully done. A very simple debate of how fairness creams are so widespread. Goes to show how people of different races still idealize, still put on a pedestal one single race. Can you tell us more about that? And then I'd also like Mr. Asif Akil's comments on that as well.
Yeah, I think he will be able to say better on sort of skin fairness. But, you know, my point would only be that, you know, it is not purely, you know, just the upper class, which is white or which is a certain, you know, race, and the others. I mean, I think, and the sociologists we have would be able to tell us better, but it's basically, you know, all structures of society trying to follow, you know, the class above them.
Yeah.
So it is not just a question of simple division. It's more complex where, you know, you have a certain, or you had a certain structure in play, and you still haven't really gotten out of the whole process of where, you know, you can go beyond it.
Yeah, let's carry that point forward with Mr. Asif Akil on that point of psychological impacts left behind. Can you tell us about that?
I think one thing is very important, that globalization has made every community feel threatened, and they want to stress their identity, like Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy, who is white, black is beautiful. So you see several races are trying to
augment their
social identity, and they also want to take some political space.
Yeah.
The other thing which is very important is that recently a study conducted by 92 scientists, the study was led by Harvard professor David Icke, and the study concluded that there is no pure race. That study came in the book form, Who We Are and How We Got Here. It clearly says that even in India and other parts of the world, races mix together. So what people in the US, like Ku Klux Klan, if they recently showed drinking milk and showing that they have tolerance for milk, unlike the black people, we see that there is rise of, rather than racism be dying, we see that globalization has actually fueled these aspects. Now, as you said, how it impacts. There is one study conducted by Steele and his colleagues. They concluded that whenever there is gender, race, or other type of threat where you think that you would be judged by your skin color or by your gender or even your obesity level, you will perform less. You will not be able to give your maximum potential out. So I think this is very,
your own potential.
Exactly.
And the point you mentioned here, Mr. Asif Akila, I'd also like Dr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa's comments on that, which is fueling white supremacy. Do you think white supremacy is on the rise today?
Yes, I think there's very strong evidence that it is on the rise. But I don't think it's a very different kind of phenomenon, really, from the various kinds of xenophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment that we've seen before. We had a wave of it with the influx of immigrants from the West Indies, a few decades ago here. Before that, of course, we had much more explicit forms of racism. So I don't think it's something new in itself. What is new is probably the ways in which it's being articulated and formulated, the ways in which particular groups now have been identified as being in opposition to white culture. And basically, we're talking about Muslims primarily here. Increasingly, European states are seeing themselves as, or identifying themselves, both at a state level and also in terms of popular culture, as being in opposition to Islam, right? As being sort of more tolerant, as being inclusive, as being liberal, whereas the opposites of those values, which are seen to be negative, are then projected onto Islam or the other. So I think both that simultaneous process of making your own history less complex by saying that we were always liberal and we were always good and we were always pure, that kind of process is definitely happening and is on the rise in all communities. I mean, it's happening with Muslims themselves.
And that's a very interesting point you made there. And Mr. Haider, on that same point, we're also seeing how national identities are seen to be under threat by these others. And could you tell us about that? Has this fear been any different now, specifically after Trump coming into power in the US? Has this been different than it was before?
Well, I think what we've got with President Trump and, for example, Brexit are symptoms of ongoing problems that have been growing over the last 2 or 3 decades, especially with the advance of neoliberal globalization. Basically, it's a free-for-all. If you can make profit, go for it. There are no restrictions. Legislation to curb the practices of monopoly powers are not there. And so we have huge inequalities and huge challenges in societies that often had much more stability and cohesion. So in this sort of going for it sort of grab here, the sort of the white majority view has become narrower and much more inward-looking. And so it's a response to globalization. Ethnic nationalism is a problem of what's happening in Poland, Hungary, but also in England. And Brexit, for example, is very much a reflection of the fact that there is a specific element of elite society that feels that they're under threat with rising global non-white populations, and that there is only so much left on this earth that we must take as quickly as we can before it all goes belly up.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because the Census Bureau issued a report in March that stated that by 2005, for the first time in the nation's history, non-Hispanic whites will no longer make up the majority of the population. So, of course, there is a fear that white individuals will be outnumbered, but why is that a fear? That's the question. And we're going to explore that later. But I'd like to thank Dr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa for joining us and Mr. Tahir Abbas, for joining us. And before we continue the conversation, we're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Indus Special. Let's continue our discussion on racial discrimination. We are now joined by Waqar Mike, who's a human rights advocate from Melbourne, and also Amira Patel, who's a humanitarian. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Mike, I'd like to take the question to you first. So we've been seeing in Australia and Melbourne, there has been a lot of issues related to protests, related to immigrants, related to African gangs. Can you tell us more about that? What has the political climate been in the past couple of months?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program and to talk to the people of Pakistan. Let me provide a bit of context to this, to the protest that happened on Saturday, which is the Saturday that just passed. You would recall that it's sometime last year, beginning of last year, in January last year, there were a lot of media reports about the so-called African gangs, which really was a story that was made up by the conservative media to talk about the youth issues in Melbourne, particularly African youth committing some offences, some disengaged young people. Really upsetting the social settings here in Melbourne. So what happened was the conservative media pounced on those reports, and despite the fact that the police basically pushed back on the reports that there was such a thing as African gangs, that people they were robbing people, they were mugging people on the streets and all that sort of a thing. Now you've got to remember there was an election, a state election in Victoria, which is Melbourne is the capital of Victoria. So there was an election which is mainly often contested between the major political parties, which is the Liberal Party, which is known here in Australia as a Conservative Party, and the Labour Party. So the contest basically was between those two parties. The Liberal Party is known to hold very conservative views, and so they pounced on the media stories that the African young people were running riot in Melbourne. So the opposition leader at the time, Matthew Guy, made it as his election campaign to say that he wanted to get back in Melbourne control because Melbourne was being run by the African gang who were running riot in Melbourne. So basically, that's for your viewers. That's the background to that story.
Mr. Mike, so you've given us the premise of what was happening, but something you mentioned here which was interesting was the conservative media propagating a certain image of the Africans over there. And my question is, how much role does the media have in creating and cementing stereotypes?
The media here in Australia is extremely powerful. There's the conservative media, which is basically here in Australia, the media that is owned and run by the News Corp, the Rupert Murdoch's own media. It's a very powerful assortment of media comprised of print, television, radio, and once they run an agenda, it becomes more like the headlines for the next few weeks or months and even years, as long as it's what they want to run their agenda on. So the media is extremely powerful here in Australia. Political discourse and social discourses begin here in the media. Politicians are aligned to the media. There's a liberal media that is going to...
Mike, stay with us at that point. I'd like to also bring Amira into the conversation. And Amira, we've been talking about this very blatant form of racism, but we are also seeing in contemporary and modern societies where there's blatant form of racism, there are also microaggressions taking place. What can you tell us about that?
It's a fundamental problem that actually reflects something along the lines of unconscious bias. So what we're talking about when you find microaggressions occurring, and these tend to play out on a day-to-day level, in the workplace, when there is a lack of representation from a diverse range of groups in a particular space. And so that's kind of what the root of the problem is. When we talk about microaggressions played out in society, across different societies across the world, and it's a significant problem that a lot of individuals from ethnic minorities face at the moment. We're talking about kind of a deeper rooted problem with regards to discrimination that just hasn't been dealt with, or the fundamental causes of discrimination like failed to have been addressed in general. And so that then affects the way people are treated. And so we see that in the UK, for example, Black British people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs than white people. So again, you can see kind of the pro forma for conflict arising and for a lack of understanding to occur amongst society when discrimination and racism isn't addressed at its base level.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you see a lot of companies and organizations now really buying into this diversity and inclusion strategy across the board in order to really try and ensure there is representation in different areas. But these measures aren't really working because they're not taking the heart of the issue kind of as the core. They're kind of focused on training people or pushing people to address those around them instead of really looking at how like these institutions are perpetuating racial bias.
Stay with us, and I want to take conversation here to Mr. Asif. Mr. Asif, what are the forms of microaggressions can take place? We know linguistically there can be many ways that it can happen. Can you tell us about that? Can you shed some light on that?
Well, I think racism has, in recent, at least in recent our memory, we have seen that many conflicts that look religious conflict, they have underlying racism underneath. So the other way is we see that xenophobia, which was also mentioned here, and then crime and hate and discrimination with women and violence against women. We have seen these patterns even in several parts of the world. Like in the US, we have seen how immigrants are treated. We also see even Rohingya issue. That is both religious and racism issue as well. Yeah, it's also a linguistic issue as well. We have also seen that this has happened in East and West Pakistan. We treated East Pakistan in a different way. We were not willing to have them government only because they had different physique and height and color, and that's what we have.
And something here that Asif alluded to, Mr. Rahim Haq, was intersectionality. If you could just let the audience know exactly what that is and how it works.
Well, my understanding of intersectionality is that you're not particularly focused on one specific aspect of discrimination, because every, so if you look at a particular issue, it could be an issue of class, it could be an issue of gender, it could be an issue of race, it could be an issue of maybe region or ethnicity. So when you want to analyze an issue, you can either analyze it from one particular aspect, or you can analyze it holistically from a number of different aspects to see, which actually makes more sense or which contributes more to that particular issue.
And one of the aspects you can analyze that through is definitely gender. And for that, I want to ask Amira, how do you think racial discrimination affects women differently than it does affect men?
I think intersectionality is really important because it highlights that there's many, many layers that individuals might be barred from accessing opportunities and from accessing equality, actually. And so when you're looking at women in particular, as you've rightly raised this issue, you often find that they're not only subject to, for example, an ethnic bias, they're then subjected to the fact that they are female and the bias that may incur. And what we see nowadays with people with kind of a multitude of factors that affect them through their identity. So being, for example, a Muslim woman, I'm not only a Muslim, I'm not only from an ethnic minority background, but I'm also a female. This means that I have 3 sets of barriers that become challenges to accessing opportunities. And so with regards to women in particular, you find that they are increasingly kind of left out of the conversation. There needs to be more work done to ensure that it's not gender that is affecting them, alongside the other 2 or 3 or 4 factors that may be impeding them from being able to access opportunities.
That's a very important point. And one of the things we want to get out of today is what's the future going to be like? And for that, Mr. Mike, I'd like to ask you, what do you think we can do to tackle this issue as people, as being a part of policymakers, the government? What do you think needs to be done?
That's a great question. We've got to understand discrimination and racism are deeply rooted in history. They go back as far as human existence. And say, for instance, here in Australia was a country that was founded on cruelty. It was a country that was founded on the annihilation of the indigenous Australians, who are black people. Their country was taken from them. They were subjugated to all forms of racism. They suffered greatly throughout the history, and even today, the situation of the indigenous people here in Australia is much worse than a lot of people that you can actually see in what they call the third world. They live in pathetic conditions, and that's primarily has to do with the discrimination and racism. So Australia is a country of robust laws. At the level of the federal level, the Commonwealth, we've got the Race Discrimination Act, which bans the discrimination against individuals based on their race. We've got religious discrimination legislation. So we've got really robust laws, and it comes back as well to the state level here in the different states have got different laws. They've got human rights charters, but nevertheless, the indigenous Australians continue to suffer greatly in this country. Muslims continue to suffer greatly in this country.
So it seems like robust laws don't really solve anything at all.
Look, they don't. Laws seem to mitigate some of the things, some of the social ills we see connected with discrimination and racism, but they don't solve anything. We've spoken about that rally that we saw last Saturday against the Africans here in Victoria that was held by the far right groups here. It didn't stop them. And then as well, you've got to remember, a lot of Western countries have got very strong laws of freedoms. The right to associate, the right to free speech, and all those. So the freedoms, those freedoms, seem to trump the other forms of rights as far as discrimination and racism are concerned. So, but that's not to say all is lost. It's not lost. I think there's optimism. There's a need to educate the society so that we can become a better society. So I think it's more or less about education rather than legislating about laws and that sort of thing.
Mike, in that note of optimism you give, there is a very, of course, the ethic of hope underlines it. And Amira, I want to ask you, something that Mr. Mike mentioned here was educating people. How important is that? How important are activities such as empathy building important when we're talking about changing people's perceptions?
I think that they're incredibly important. And I think if the education starts from a very, very young age, when we're talking about kind of diverse environments, undoing any biases that you may have from a very, very young age, then we would hopefully be able to see all of the institutions around us reflect society more accurately. and kind of really set kind of the parameters for the type of society that we would all like to live in, which would be free of discrimination.
And on that point, hold on to that thought. I'm going to take the discussion here to Mr. As. How important do you think empathy is?
I think empathy and critical thinking as well. We need to bring these things in our education curriculum. And I also think that this starts with the state. If the state first understand that we need to celebrate diversity with unity, then that will reflect in our education and the processes of socialization. So I think until the state is not willing to take it up, we cannot be celebrating diversity.
Okay. Mr. Rahimul Haq, do you agree with that opinion that it starts with the state?
Well, it can start with the state, but who's gonna force or convince the state to actually do anything? So I think it's both the society, the societal pressure, social movements, and can you actually, because state comes out of a structure of society. It's built on certain structures. So unless and until the society exerts pressure for change, it's possible that the state really doesn't do much.
Also, modern democracies are voted in on certain fears. The Trump administration was voted in on a certain fear that existed amongst the population that they capitalized on. So
right. So it depends now. It depends whether Trump can undo some of the progress that actually seeped into the American institutional structure. So, if you have a more progressive movement, for example, the Black Lives Movement in the US, has had an impact in the sense of raising the consciousness of the population. It may not have had an impact of where holding Trump back, but still, I think both of these things go together. I think the society and the social movements and the impact they have, as well as the structure of the state, whether that's transformed, I think both of these have an impact in, either creating a better future or making things worse.
That's a very important point there. And Mr. Mike, I also want to ask you on that similar point, how important is social activism in raising national consciousness about these matters?
I think it's I do echo the sentiments that the previous speaker made there. It's extremely important, and particularly I'll answer that question in regard to what we do here in Melbourne. Last year, when we had all those reports about the so-called African gangs in the media being dominated by those stories, we took it upon ourselves to move against those stories, and particularly the hashtag African Gangs, which was that social media campaign which I founded, was it really resonated quite well with the populace here in Australia and across the whole world. We used the negativity that was coming out of the media and used it to our advantage, and it really resonated with the people, as I said, and. As we speak, a lot of young Africans who have a voice in the media. Quite often we're heard in the media, we're heard on social issues, we're heard on political issues, and I think it's really an important aspect of what young people across the world need to take on, whether these are young people in Pakistan or these are young people anywhere in the world. It's really their responsibility to use social media to their advantage, because whatever stories that are being discussed in Pakistan, here in Melbourne or in London or in Istanbul, people will come across them and they will resonate with the whole world. So I think we've got a whole dimension of social activism, which can be propagated through the social media.
And Mr. Mike, that's an important point, which I'm also going to take to Amira. How do you think social activism has been revolutionized, specifically when we're talking about related to racism, racial discrimination, with the advent of social media, and how do you think it's changing with that?
I think it provides a wonderful platform to really shout out about the work that a lot of brilliant organizations are already doing. So we often find that individuals and organizations are already putting into place these things, not only from from peaceful protests and things like that, but actually working with organizations. I work to train up inclusion teams on unconscious bias and racial discrimination. And so really social media allows you to multiply your impact by letting people really know what you're doing and spreading the word even further. I think in a lot of ways, it also allows movements to transgress national boundaries. So in the case of Black Lives Matter, for example, we saw that really boom in the United States. And then kind of a few months later, we saw the development of the Black Lives Matter movement in England. And so really, it allows activists to connect in solidarity, especially in times when governments aren't as accountable or where policies exist but just aren't being implemented. We need more activists to be connecting using social media.
Yeah, and that's a very important point. Social media needs to be used as a tool for empowering people. I want to move on to Mr. Rahimul Haq. I was talking earlier about optimism when Mr. Mike mentioned that he's optimistic about the future, and I want your comments on that. Are you optimistic about the future when it comes to racial discrimination?
Yes, I am, partly because, again, it depends. I think one can't necessarily look at the world as a whole. I mean, there are, it's still divided into nation states and policies. And so I agree with Amira that activists need to connect. But let's be very clear. I mean, while progressive activists are connecting on the internet, it's the other activists who are also doing their part on social media. So I think social media needs to be looked at very critically because you have closed networks in, for instance, WhatsApp. It's not open network. Similarly, it's exclusive. You work within your own group. So I think for progressive activists, what is important is, and as an activist, I mean, I can speak that only if you have activity on the ground, only then social media can actually expand it and highlight it and allow you to connect with others. But you still need to have something going on the ground. So I think it's a question of whether societies allow that space for activism on the ground. And number two, is there political education of the youth who actually take these issues forward and actually do activism on them? Because what we've seen is that in certain societies, we've seen a lot of depoliticization also. So I don't think one can talk generally around the world. I think it is very specific depending upon, where you are, which state you're in, which country you're in, which location you're in. So I would take it as a mixed bag. But I do think that yes, we are moving forward. I mean, if you look at Rhodes Must Fall, which was a whole movement of South African students against colonization and wanting to decolonize their universities, had a huge impact in South Africa. Black Lives Matter. So yes, it does matter. But again, you would not have exactly the same impact, let's say, in Pakistan, for instance.
I take your point there, and Mr. Asif on that point, he mentioned the youth here. How important is educating the youth in this regard to make sure that the generations that come after aren't plagued with the same biases?
I think that's most important one, that we work with children and we work with youth, and it's easier for youth to convince and convey and tell them how and why racism hasn't helped us in the last like 10,000 years. So I think universities and schools and colleges can be the best place where we can reach them and we can have this all, as Mr. Rahim said, that it's not just the activism on social media. The first thing is that we reach out to them, we talk to them, we convey to them, and I think we can see we can have hope. I agree with Mr. Rahim that there is hope. We can have change in our for our coming generations.
That's a very important point. And Mr. Mike, on that process, on that conversation of when we're talking about having hope, how important is the role of institutions such as universities and schools in helping children dislearn racial biases and also prevent them from formulating racial biases?
Very, very, very extremely important. We've got to know as well from history, universities were used as the conduit for propagating the discrimination and racism. And likewise, universities have been used to lessen and mitigate the spread of racism, because it's from universities that our children are taught on the concepts of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I think, especially universities that are well renounced, that do have a major presence internationally. I think here, speaking from the Australian perspective, universities, as far back as just very recently, there was a group of politicians, former politicians, wanted to have Western civilization, in particular course on Western civilization, to be taught, not accepting that every other course in universities across the Western world is about Western civilization. You talk about history, people talk about Greek history, they talk about Roman history. In law, all the courses that we studied in law were all about Western civilization. In mathematics, every single thing is about Western civilization. Nevertheless, they wanted a particular course to be taught.
Mike, we're running short on time, and that's a very important point, which I'm going to carry forward to Amira before we end the show. How important is it to integrate a multicultural perspective in the schooling curriculum to make sure that we counter these biases?
I think it's integral, exactly as Maka just mentioned, that in educational institutions, from simple subjects such as English and history, we should have diversity amongst the types of books that are used, in terms of the subjects that are taught. You're going to have a completely different outcome if a young person is taught world history beyond colonization and the history of Roman civilization, and that's across the world. And this is a problem that we not only see in the West, but we see like in India, in Pakistan, we still see the national curriculum very, very dominated by the same type of historical discourse. And so we really, really need to see diversity in our curriculums in order to combat this problem from an early stage.
Thank you so much, Amira Patel, and thank you for joining us on the show. Thank you, Mike, for joining us on the show. Asif Akil, Rahimul Haq, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope to see you again next week.